Part One, Chapter One, Introductory. Some details of the biography of that highly respected gentleman, Stepan Trofimovitch Verhovensky. Section 1. In undertaking to describe the recent and strange incidents in our town, till lately wrapped in uneventful obscurity, I find myself forced, in absence of literary skill, to begin my story rather far back, that is to say, with certain biographical details concerning that talented and highly esteemed gentleman, Stepan Trofimovitch Verhovensky. I trust that these details may at least serve as an introduction, while my projected story itself will come later. I will say at once that Stepan Trofimovitch had always filled a particular rôle among us, that of the progressive patriot, so to say. And he was passionately fond of playing the part, so much so that I really believe he could not have existed without it. Not that I would put him on a level with an actor at a theatre, God forbid, for I really have a respect for him. This may all have been the effect of habit, or rather, more exactly, of a generous propensity he had, from his earliest years, for indulging in an agreeable day-dream in which he figured as a picturesque public character. He fondly loved, for instance, his position as a persecuted man, and, so to speak, an exile. There is a sort of traditional glamour about those two little words that fascinated him once for all, and, exalting him gradually in his own opinion, raised him in the course of years to a lofty pedestal very gratifying to vanity. In an English satire of the last century, Gulliver, returning from the land of the Lilliputians, where the people were only 3 or 4 inches high, had grown so accustomed to consider himself a giant among them, that as he walked along the streets of London he could not help crying out to carriagers and passers-by to be careful and get out of his way, for fear he should crush them, imagining that they were little and he was still a giant. He was laughed at and abused for it, and rough coachmen even lashed at the giant with their whips. But was that just? What may not be done by habit? Habit had brought Stepan Trofimovitch almost to the same position, but in a more innocent and inoffensive form, if one may use such expressions, for he was a most excellent man. I am even inclined to suppose that towards the end he had been entirely forgotten everywhere, but still it cannot be said that his name had never been known. It is beyond question that he had at one time belonged to a certain distinguished constellation of celebrated leaders of the last generation, and at one time, though only for the briefest moment, his name was pronounced by many hasty persons of that day almost as though it were on a level with the names of Tchadayev, of Byelinsky, of Granovsky, and of Herzen, who had only just begun to write abroad. But Stepan Trofimovitch's activity ceased almost at the moment it began, owing, so to say, to a vortex of combined circumstances. And would you believe it? It turned out afterwards that there had been no vortex, and even no circumstances, at least in that connection. I only learned the other day, to my intense amazement, though on the most unimpeachable authority, that Stepan Trofimovitch had lived among us in our province not as an exile, as we were accustomed to believe, and had never even been under police supervision at all. Such is the force of imagination. All his life he sincerely believed that in certain spheres he was a constant cause of apprehension, that every step he took was watched and noted, and that each one of the 3 governors who succeeded one another during 20 years in our province came with special and uneasy ideas concerning him, which had, by higher powers, been impressed upon each before everything else, on receiving the appointment. Had any one assured the honest man on the most irrefutable grounds that he had nothing to be afraid of, he would certainly have been offended. Yet Stepan Trofimovitch was a most intelligent and gifted man, even, so to say, a man of science, though indeed in science, well, in fact, he had not done such great things in science. I believe, indeed, he had done nothing at all. But that's very often the case, of course, with men of science among us in Russia. He came back from abroad and was brilliant in the capacity of lecturer at the university towards the end of the 40's. He only had time to deliver a few lectures. I believe they were about the Arabs. He maintained, too, a brilliant thesis on the political and Hanseatic importance of the German town Hanau, of which there was promise in the epoch between 1413 and 1428, and on the special and obscure reasons why that promise was never fulfilled. This dissertation was a cruel and skilful thrust at the Slavophiles of the day, and at once made him numerous and irreconcilable enemies among them. Later on, after he had lost his post as lecturer, however, he published, by way of revenge, so to say, and to show them what a man they had lost, in a progressive monthly review, which translated Dickens and advocated the views of George Sand, the beginning of a very profound investigation into the causes, I believe, of the extraordinary moral nobility of certain knights at a certain epoch, or something of that nature. Some lofty and exceptionally noble idea was maintained in it, anyway. It was said afterwards that the continuation was hurriedly forbidden, and even that the Progressive Review had to suffer for having printed the first part. That may very well have been so, for what was not possible in those days? Though in this case it is more likely that there was nothing of the kind, and that the author himself was too lazy to conclude his essay. He cut short his lectures on the Arabs because somehow and by someone, probably one of his reactionary enemies, a letter had been seized giving an account of certain circumstances, in consequence of which someone had demanded an explanation from him. I don't know whether the story is true, but it was asserted that at the same time there was discovered in Petersburg a vast, unnatural, and illegal conspiracy of 30 people which almost shook society to its foundations. It was said that they were positively on the point of translating Fourier. As though of design, a poem of Stepan Trofimovitch's was seized in Moscow at that very time, though it had been written 6 years before in Berlin in his earliest youth, and manuscript copies had been passed round a circle consisting of 2 poetical amateurs and 1 student. This poem is lying now on my table. No longer ago than last year I received a recent copy in his own handwriting from Stepan Trofimovitch himself, signed by him and bound in a splendid red leather binding. It is not without poetic merit, however, and even a certain talent. It's strange, but in those days, or to be more exact, in the 30's, people were constantly composing in that style. I find it difficult to describe the subject, for I really do not understand it. It is some sort of an allegory in lyrical dramatic form, recalling the second part of Faust. The scene opens with a chorus of women, followed by a chorus of men, then a chorus of incorporeal powers of some sort, and at the end of all a chorus of spirits not yet living but very eager to come to life. All these choruses sing about something very indefinite, for the most part about somebody's curse, but with a tinge of the higher humour. But the scene is suddenly changed. There begins a sort of festival of life, at which even insects sing. A tortoise comes on the scene with certain sacramental Latin words. And even, if I remember aright, a mineral sings about something that is a quite inanimate object. In fact, they all sing continually, or if they converse, it is simply to abuse one another vaguely, but again with a tinge of higher meaning. At last the scene is changed again. A wilderness appears, and among the rocks there wanders a civilized young man who picks and sucks certain herbs. Asked by a fairy why he sucks these herbs, he answers that, conscious of a superfluity of life in himself, he seeks forgetfulness, and finds it in the juice of these herbs, but that his great desire is to lose his reason at once, a desire possibly superfluous. Then a youth of indescribable beauty rides in on a black steed, and an immense multitude of all nations follow him. The youth represents Death, for whom all the peoples are yearning. And finally, in the last scene, we are suddenly shown the Tower of Babel, and certain athletes at last finish building it with a song of new hope, and when at length they complete the topmost pinnacle, the Lord of Olympia, let us say, takes flight in a comic fashion, and man, grasping the situation and seizing his place, at once begins a new life with new insight into things. while this poem was thought at that time to be dangerous. Last year I proposed to Stepan Trofimovitch to publish it, on the ground of its perfect harmlessness nowadays, but he declined the suggestion with evident dissatisfaction. My view of its complete harmlessness evidently displeased him, and I even ascribed to it a certain coldness on his part, which lasted 2 whole months. And what do you think? Suddenly, almost at the time I proposed printing it here, our poem was published abroad in a collection of revolutionary verse, without the knowledge of Stepan Trofimovitch. He was at first alarmed, rushed to the governor, and wrote a noble letter in self-defence to Petersburg. He read it to me twice, but did not send it, not knowing to whom to address it. In fact, he was in a state of agitation for a whole month, but I am convinced that in the secret recesses of his heart he was enormously flattered. He almost took the copy of the collection to bed with him, and kept it hidden under his mattress in the daytime. He positively would not allow the women to turn his bed, and although he expected every day a telegram, he held his head high. No telegram came. Then he made friends with me again, which is a proof of the extreme kindness of his gentle and unresentful heart. 2. Of course I don't assert that he had never suffered for his convictions at all, but I am fully convinced that he might have gone on lecturing on his Arabs as long as he liked, if he had only given the necessary explanations. But he was too lofty, and he proceeded with peculiar haste to assure himself that his career was ruined forever by the vortex of circumstance. And if the whole truth is to be told, the real cause of the change in his career was the very delicate proposition which had been made before and was then renewed by Varvara Petrovna Stavrogin, a lady of great wealth, the wife of a lieutenant general, that he should undertake the education and the whole intellectual development of her only son, in the capacity of a superior sort of teacher and friend, to say nothing of a magnificent salary. This proposal had been made to him the first time in Berlin at the moment when he was first left a widower. His first wife was a frivolous girl from our province, whom he married in his early and unthinking youth, and apparently he had had a great deal of trouble with this young person, charming as she was, owing to the lack of means for her support, and also from other more delicate reasons. She died in Paris after 3 years' separation from him, leaving him a son of 5 years old. The fruit of our first, joyous, and unclouded love, were the words the sorrowing father once let fall in my presence. The child had, from the first, been sent back to Russia, where he was brought up in the charge of distant cousins in some remote region. Stepan Trofimovitch had declined Varvara Petrovna's proposal on that occasion and had quickly married again, before the year was over, a taciturn Berlin girl. And, what makes it more strange, there was no particular necessity for him to do so. But apart from his marriage there were, it appears, other reasons for his declining the situation. He was tempted by the resounding fame of a professor, celebrated at that time, and he, in his turn, hastened to the lecturer's chair for which he had been preparing himself to try his eagle wings in flight. But now, with singed wings, he naturally remembered the proposition which even then had made him hesitate. The sudden death of his second wife, who did not live a year with him, settled the matter decisively. To put it plainly, it was all brought about by the passionate sympathy and priceless, so to speak, classic friendship of Varvara Petrovna, if one may use such an expression of friendship. He flung himself into the arms of this friendship, and his position was settled for more than 20 years. I use the expression flung himself into the arms of, but God forbid that any one should fly to idle and superfluous conclusions. These embraces must be understood only in the most loftily moral sense. The most refined and delicate tie united these two beings, both so remarkable, for ever. The post of tutor was the more readily accepted too, as the property, a very small one, left to Stepan Trofimovitch by his first wife, was close to Skvoreshniki, the Stavrogins' magnificent estate on the outskirts of our provincial town. Besides, in the stillness of his study, Far from the immense burden of university work, it was always possible to devote himself to the service of science, and to enrich the literature of his country with erudite studies. These works did not appear, but on the other hand it did appear possible to spend the rest of his life, more than 20 years, a reproach incarnate, so to speak, to his native country, in the words of a popular poet: "Reproach incarnate thou didst stand erect before thy fatherland, O liberal idealist." But the person to whom the popular poet referred may perhaps have had the right to adopt that pose for the rest of his life if he had wished to do so, though it must have been tedious. Our Stepan Trofimovitch was, to tell the truth, only an imitator compared with such people. Moreover, he had grown weary of standing erect, and often lay down for a while. But to do him justice, the incarnation of reproach was preserved even in the recumbent attitude, the more so as that was quite sufficient for the province. You should have seen him at our club when he sat down to cards. His whole figure seemed to exclaim: "Cards? Me sit down to whist with you? Is it consistent? Who is responsible for it? Who has shattered my energies and turned them to whist? Ah, perish Russia!" And he would majestically trump with a heart. And to tell the truth, he dearly loved a game of cards, which led him, especially in later years, into frequent and unpleasant skirmishes with Varvara Petrovna, particularly as he was always losing. But of that later. I will only observe that he was a man of tender conscience, that is, sometimes, and so was often depressed. In the course of his 20 years' friendship with Varvara Petrovna he used regularly 3 or 4 times a year to sink into a state of patriotic grief, as it was called among us, or rather really into an attack of spleen, but our estimable Varvara Petrovna preferred the former phrase. Of late years his grief had begun to be not only patriotic, but at times alcoholic too. But Varvara Petrovna's alertness succeeded in keeping him all his life from trivial inclinations. And he needed some one to look after him indeed, for he sometimes behaved very oddly. In the midst of his exalted sorrow he would begin laughing like any simple peasant. There were moments when he began to take a humorous tone even about himself. But there was nothing Varvara Petrovna dreaded so much as a humorous tone. She was a woman of the classic type, a female Maecenas, invariably guided only by the highest considerations. The influence of this exalted lady over her poor friend for 20 years is a fact of the first importance. I shall need to speak of her more particularly, which I now proceed to do. End of Part 1, Chapter 1, Section 1 of The Possessed.